They found her in a cave in the Zagros Mountains, Iran, 2017. Skeleton about 9,000 years old. When scientists extracted DNA from her femur and ran the full genome analysis, they found something nobody expected. She carried the gene for light-colored eyes. 9,000 years ago, before any empire, before agriculture had even spread across the region, before the wheel. Her name, given to her by researchers, was the Zagros woman, and she had no idea she was about to break one of the most stubborn myths in human genetics. So let's start with the thing you probably believe without realizing you believe it. Green eyes come from Europe. Maybe from Ireland or Scandinavia or somewhere cold and northern, where pale skin and light features seem to cluster together. That's the assumption most people carry without ever examining it. It feels intuitive. It feels obvious. It's wrong, and the real answer is so much stranger. Here's the actual puzzle. Green eyes appear in roughly 2% of the global population, 2%. That makes them rarer than type O negative blood, rarer than left-handedness, rarer than almost any physical trait you can name. But they don't cluster only in Northern Europe. They show up in pockets throughout Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan's northern mountain regions, in parts of Turkey and Syria. In scattered communities across the Caucasus, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan. And when scientists started comparing DNA not just of living people, but of ancient human remains going back thousands of years, the picture got strange very fast. Because the gene wasn't concentrated in the people you'd expect to find it in. Let's be precise about what we're actually talking about, because this is where most popular science goes sideways. Eye color isn't controlled by one gene. It's a spectrum shaped by perhaps 16 different genes working in combination. But there's one genetic region that does the heavy lifting, chromosome 15, a stretch of DNA involving two overlapping genes called OCA2 and HERC2. The OCA2 gene controls melanin production in the iris, essentially how much pigment your eye makes. A specific mutation in the region adjacent to it within the HERC2 gene acts like a dimmer switch. It dials down OCA2 expression, reducing melanin output. Less melanin, blue or green eyes. Maximum melanin, brown. Here's where it gets interesting. Blue eyes are now definitively traced to a single mutation that occurred somewhere between 6 and 10,000 years ago in a common ancestor, almost certainly one person, one individual who happened to have more surviving descendants than their siblings. That mutation spread, but green eyes are genetically distinct from blue. Different expression levels, additional modifying genes, a slightly different biochemical mechanism. You don't get green eyes simply by having less melanin than brown and more than blue. There are additional genetic factors modulating the result. Tracing where those factors originated and in which ancient population they first concentrated is exactly what researchers set out to determine. They didn't start with living people. They started with bones. Between 2015 and 2023, ancient DNA research transformed what we thought we knew about human prehistory. Techniques for extracting genetic material from skeletal remains, particularly from the petrous bone, the dense section behind the ear that preserves DNA better than almost any other tissue, improved beyond what anyone predicted was possible. Suddenly, scientists could get full genome sequences from individuals who had died 10,000 years ago. And they began assembling a genetic map of ancient Europe, the Middle East, and Central Asia that looked almost nothing like the map built from studying living populations. Here's what emerged. Ancient Europe was not the cradle of light-colored eyes. It was the mixing pot. The continent was populated in distinct waves, each genetically different from the last. First came the Western hunter-gatherers people who had been in Europe since the last ice age, tens of thousands of years of continuous presence. And here's the part that still surprises most people when they hear it. Many of these ancient Western Europeans appear to have had relatively dark skin combined with light or blue eyes, a combination almost nobody carries today. Then came farmers from Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, who spread northwest beginning around 7,000 years ago, bringing a different set of genetic variants with them. And finally, starting around 5,000 years ago, came a massive migration from the Eurasian steppes east of the Black Sea. These were the Yamnaya, cattle herders, horseback riders, people who carried a package of genes that would transform the population of Europe so thoroughly that most modern Europeans carry around 40 to 60% Yamnaya ancestry. Each of these groups contributed pieces of the pigmentation puzzle. Each carried different frequencies of different variants. But when researchers specifically isolated and mapped the genetic variants associated with green eyes, not blue, not hazel, specifically green, something unusual appeared in the data. The highest ancient frequencies weren't in Western hunter-gatherers. They weren't in early Anatolian farmers. They were disproportionately concentrated in a group that most people have never heard of, the Caucasian hunter-gatherers, abbreviated CHG in the literature. Ancient populations from the mountainous corridor between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, the Caucasus region, modern-day Georgia, parts of Armenia, northern Iran, and this is where the story turns. The Caucasian hunter-gatherers weren't Europeans, they weren't Middle Eastern farmers, they were something distinct, a genetically isolated population that had survived the last ice age in that specific mountain refuge, largely cut off from the massive population movements happening in the frozen lowlands around them. The Caucasus acted as a sanctuary. While ice sheets covered northern Europe and the central steppes turned to frozen desert, these mountain valleys remain habitable. Populations survived there in relative isolation for tens of thousands of years, their genetic profile becoming concentrated and specific. When the ice retreated and barriers dissolved, they moved, or rather, their genes moved, east into Central Asia and eventually into South Asia through the ancient Iranian plateau, north into the steppe, feeding genetically into what would become the Yamnaya, which means that when the Yamnaya then swept west into Europe, they carried Caucasian hunter-gatherer ancestry with them, a kind of double transmission westward. And some CHG populations moved directly west as well, mixing into Anatolian and later European populations through routes along the coastlines and river valleys. This is why you find green eyes in Ireland and in Iran, why you find them in Scotland and in the Pamir Mountains of Tajikistan, and in certain families in Pakistan's Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province. They aren't a European trait that somehow traveled east through obscure migration. They're a Caucasian trait in the literal, geographic sense that traveled in every direction simultaneously, carried by multiple migration streams from a single ancestral source region. Think about what that means when you hold it for a moment. Every green-eyed person alive today, wherever they live, whatever their culture, whatever language they speak, they carry a genetic signal from a group of people who retreated into mountain caves during the last ice age and held on, who survived while the world froze. Their gene pool was locked in by geography, preserved, concentrated, and when the world warmed and the ice retreated and the barriers came down, that concentrated signal poured out across the ancient world in multiple directions at once. The Zagros woman wasn't an anomaly. She was close to the origin. Now, one thing researchers are careful to emphasize, and it's worth being clear about here, is that one ancient group doesn't mean one family, one tribe, one village. The Caucasian hunter-gatherers weren't a unified political entity. They were a cluster of related populations across a geographic region, sharing deep ancestry and sharing genetic variants, including the pigmentation variants associated with green eyes. The signal appears most strongly in them compared to every other ancient population sampled, but it's a frequency pattern, not a clean dividing line. Population genetics works in gradients and probabilities. What it's showing here is that if you trace this specific genetic feature backward through time, the signal concentrates in this one ancestral group more than anywhere else in the ancient human world. There's also the question of why the trait persisted and spread rather than getting diluted into invisibility. The honest answer is that nobody can say with certainty. Light-colored eyes in high altitude or low-light environments may have offered some selective advantage. Theories range from vitamin D metabolism to enhanced low-light vision, but the evidence for any specific advantage remains inconclusive. Sometimes a trait spreads simply because the people carrying it were in the right place when migration happened, and their descendants happen to be numerous. But there's a more provocative possibility that some researchers have cautiously raised. Multiple ancient cultures assign spiritual significance to unusual eye colors. Green and light eyes in particular were associated in various traditions with supernatural perception, with the ability to see what ordinary people could not. If green-eyed individuals in these ancient communities were more likely to be elevated as spiritual leaders, shamans, or high-status figures with the resource access and mating advantages that status brings, the gene could have spread through cultural selection entirely distinct from biological pressure. A trait amplified not by survival advantage in the traditional sense, but by the meaning a community attached to it. That's speculative, but it isn't groundless speculation. Ancient Mesopotamian texts reference eye color in the context of divination. Egyptian ritual art specifically marks light-eyed figures. The pattern appears across unconnected cultures in the region, and the Caucasus was the geographic center of a trade and migration corridor connecting all of them. So we started with a skeleton in an Iranian cave, and we end here with the understanding that green eyes aren't a European trait that traveled east, but a Caucasian one that traveled everywhere west into what became modern Europe, east into Central Asia, north into the steppe populations that would later reshape the European continent, scattered thin across humanity because the group that concentrated it was never large, a mountain refuge population, not an empire. Not a civilization, just people who survived the cold in the right place and whose descendants happen to be mobile. 2% of the world's population, one ancient group at the starting point. And the thing I keep returning to, most people who carry this gene have no idea what they're carrying. A woman in Dublin has no reason to think about the Zagros Mountains when she looks in the mirror. A man in Islamabad doesn't connect his eye color to Ice Age survival in the Georgian highlands, but the connection is there. In the sequencing data, in the ancient genomes, in the direct line running from 9,000 years ago to now. If this kind of detective work through ancient DNA interests you, and there are a dozen stories just like this one, each one rewriting something we thought we understood about where modern humans came from and how they got to where they are, subscribe, because we're not close to done. The next video involves a genetic marker found in a specific coastal population that shows up, completely unexplained, in people thousands of kilometers inland with no known ancestral connection. Different gene, same kind of impossible trail. And drop a comment. Do you have green eyes? Where's your family from? I'm genuinely curious whether the geography lines up with what the ancient DNA is showing.